Close your eyes and you will probably see a magnificent picture in your mind's eye. Mighty stone walls, flags soaring over battlements, valiant knights in shining armor, feasting in huge halls under vaulted ceilings. You can hear the clink of goblets, laughter, and the echo of a minstrel lute. Perhaps you can imagine cozy bedrooms with feather beds, massive fireplaces blazing with bright flames, and the aroma of delicious dishes wafting from the kitchen. This is the image of a medieval castle, firmly rooted in our minds thanks to chivalrous novels, epic films, and fantasy games. It is a symbol of strength, romance, and inviolability. But what if I told you that this image is just a thin veil woven from myths and romantic fantasies, having almost nothing to do with the harsh, often disgusting, but surprisingly inventive reality of everyday life inside a real middle-century English castle? What if everyday existence there was a constant, exhausting struggle for survival, where every day was a challenge and comfort was absolute luxury? Are you ready to put aside the myths and look behind the massive oak gate to see what the inhabitants of these stone giants really smelled like? What they ate, how they slept, and what they struggled with just to live another day? The answers lie in yellowed chronicles, archaeological digs, and the writings of historians who piece by piece reconstruct a picture that is far from glossy. This is a story about a world where dampness was ubiquitous and food could be deadly, where lack of hygiene gave rise to diseases and the building itself turned into a complex survival mechanism. Stay tuned and you will learn why the castle's dungeons could be warmer than the upper rooms, how special wells caught the tears of stone walls, how polished shields became solar panels, why nightlight mushrooms saved lives, why were wind chimneys made in walls, why the keyhole was more important than it seems, why stone beds were a luxury, and how the wine cellar became a veritable thermos of survival. This is a journey into the heart of medieval fortitude, a real English castle. In a medieval castle, where medicine was primitive and disease rampant, survival often depended on desperate and sometimes terrifying practices. One of the most common and, in the opinion of the doctors of that time, vital procedures was bloodletting. This is not just a medical method, but a whole ritual that was used to treat almost any ailment, from fever and headache to inflammation and even melancholy. In the conditions of the castle, where access to qualified healers was limited and the risk of illness was high, bloodletting became one of the main survival tools in the fight against ailments. According to the humoral theory that dominated medieval medicine, diseases were caused by an imbalance of four fluids, humors in the body: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Excess blood, or fullness of blood, was thought to be the cause of many problems. Bloodletting, whether with lancets, small knives, scarifiers, incision tools, or more eerily leeches, was supposed to restore this balance and release the disease from the body. Imagine a picture. In a cold, semi-dark room of the castle, perhaps in the infirmary or even directly in the living room, a sick person lies. The healer or barber, who often perform these functions, selects a vein, usually on the arm or neck, and makes an incision. Blood flows into a special vessel, often decorated with divisions to measure out the right amount. Alternatively, fat, wriggling leeches are applied to the patient's body, which stick to the skin and begin to draw blood. This process could be incredibly painful and frightening, especially for children. For a modern person, this sounds wild and dangerous because blood loss weakens the body, makes it more vulnerable to infections, and can lead to anemia. However, in the Middle Ages, it was an act of faith in medicine and a desperate attempt to save a life. It was believed that the patient felt relieved after bloodletting, although this was often due to a drop in blood pressure and temporary weakness. In conditions where antibiotics did not exist and hygiene was at zero, bloodletting, although often harmful, could sometimes, purely accidentally in certain conditions, bring temporary relief, for example, with high blood pressure or certain inflammations. The risk of infection from non-sterile instruments was enormous. The wounds often became inflamed, leading to sepsis and death. But for the medieval inhabitants of the castle, faced with the disease, it was one of the few available treatment methods that gave at least some hope of survival. This fact is horrifying in its cruelty and naivety, but at the same time impresses with the desperate faith of people in their methods of dealing with death. In a harsh, prolonged winter, when rivers and surface springs were completely frozen, and snow was difficult to melt in large volumes due to its low thermal conductivity and high energy costs for heating, fresh water extraction became a critical problem for any castle that could decide its fate. Water was necessary not only for drinking, but also for cooking, basic hygiene as far as possible, and for animals. In addition to the traditional use of ale, cider, and wine as the main drinks, which were less susceptible to freezing and were considered safer to drink due to fermentation, alcohol killed some of the bacteria. Some castles, according to archaeological and historical studies, may have had secret cisterns or underground cisterns specially designed for a unique purpose. These structures were designed to collect condensation moisture generated from the breath of many people and animals who constantly lived in the castle, as well as from the fumes from numerous hearths, stoves, kitchens, and baths, if any. In the cold but often humid air inside the massive stone walls of the castle, the moisture contained in the exhaled air of people and animals, in the fumes from cooking, from wet clothes, and even from the wet earth in the lower floors and dungeons, settled on the cold stone walls and ceilings of these specially constructed wells or cisterns. These vertical shafts or underground chambers served as a kind of giant refrigerators or condensers, where the temperature difference between the internal, relatively warm and humid air of the castle and the frozen stone walls of the underground structure led to an intense condensation process. The water vapor cooled, turning into tiny droplets that slowly but surely trickled down their surfaces, collecting in a tank at the bottom. Slowly but surely, this passive method made it possible to collect relatively clean water. It was much cleaner than water from open springs contaminated with sewage and corpses. Due to the fact that this water accumulated in the depths isolated from surface frost, it did not freeze as quickly as water in open springs or even in ordinary wells near the surface, which was a vital advantage in conditions of severe frosts and prolonged sieges. It was a passive but ingenious ice trap that used the fundamental laws of physics, condensation, gravity, and temperature differences to maintain life inside the stone fortress. In some cases, such wells could be connected to primitive ventilation systems or air ducts that directed warm, moist air from living rooms, kitchens, or even stables to these underground chambers, thereby significantly increasing the amount of condensate collected. This made it possible to maximize water output without additional energy or effort, making the system incredibly efficient for its conditions. Thus, these water traps were not just an engineering solution, but evidence of a deep understanding of natural processes and their intuitive use for survival in the harshest conditions. This ingenuity gave these systems an almost mystical touch of genius, emphasizing the ability of medieval engineers to adapt their buildings to the challenges of nature with minimal resources and maximum ingenuity. Perhaps only a few people knew about these wells, and they were part of the secrets of the castle, passed down from generation to generation, which made them even more mysterious and valuable for survival, real hiding places of life. In rich castles where not only precious metals were available, but also expertly crafted, polished metal surfaces, from carefully polished tin, shiny copper, and sometimes even silver or highly polished bronze. These items could be used far beyond mere decoration, status symbols, or tools for self-love. They served a much more utilitarian and vital purpose. As primitive but surprisingly efficient solar concentrators, able to capture and direct even the faintest rays of the winter sun, turning them into a semblance of heat. On clear but treacherously cold winter days, when the sun was low on the horizon and its rays were weak, diffuse, and seemingly powerless against the biting cold, large polished metal plates, ceremonial shields, decorative panels, and even specially made concave metal surfaces, similar to parabolic mirrors, could be strategically placed near window openings or windows. In deep niches, their arrangement was not random. It was carefully designed to reflect and focus the scant rays of the sun as much as possible on certain, most important areas of the room. It could be the workbench of a hardworking artisan, for example, a scribe of manuscripts, for whom every ray of light was worth its weight in gold, or a place where a lord or lady rested, or even directly for one person trying to keep warm. Imagine, in a gloomy frozen castle hall, where the stones exuded cold, suddenly a thin but bright beam of light appears, carrying with it not only visual, but also subtle heat, capable, for example, of warming icy fingers. Although this method could not, of course, provide full heating of the whole room, and perhaps did not give much heat in the modern sense. We are not talking about heating to boiling, but only about raising the temperature by several degrees in the local zone, which was significant for the Middle Ages. It created a precious, local comfort point. It was a place where you could at least warm up a little, stretch your frozen fingers, work on small details that required precise vision, such as reading or sewing, or just take a break from the biting, all-encompassing cold that permeated every corner of the castle. It was like receiving a blessing from the Sun itself, its focused, almost mystical touch in a world of hibernation and darkness. For people of the Middle Ages who did not have access to powerful sources of energy, the use of natural light and heat was an act of deep pragmatism, intuitive understanding of natural forces, and manifestations of amazing ingenuity. Later, in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, when architectural and construction technologies developed and the desire for comfort and aesthetics grew, some window openings in the most important and frequently used rooms of castles could be improved. They could have specially polished internal slopes made of light stone, for example, limestone or marble, or carefully plastered surfaces covered with lime. The goal was not only for aesthetics, but also to enhance this effect of reflection and scattering of light, which was then directed deeper into the room. This created not only the illusion of a magic ray of heat, but also made the rooms visually brighter and less depressing during the long, dark winter months, which was of great psychological importance. The fight against winter depression and despondency was no less important than the fight against the cold. This practice demonstrates not only the ingenuity and observation of the people of that time, who were able to use even the weakest resources of nature to improve their everyday life, but also their desire for aesthetics, which went hand in hand with functionality. This use of light was not just a method of heating, but a kind of alchemy of light, turning a meager winter ray into a source of vitality and comfort. In a world without fridges and freezers, preserving food was a constant battle, especially in a castle setting where supplies had to be huge and long-lasting. Winter, which brought with it severe frosts, paradoxically made it possible to create Adania ice barns, primitive but surprisingly effective systems for storing ice, which was then used to preserve food in the warm season. This wasn't just storage, but strategic accumulation of cold, vital for survival. In the dead of winter, when the rivers, lakes, and ponds around the castle were covered with a thick layer of ice, a large-scale operation began. Peasants and servants, armed with pickaxes, crowbars, and saws, went out to the frozen ponds. They cut out huge blocks of ice, sometimes a meter thick and weighing hundreds of kilograms. This work was incredibly difficult and dangerous, especially on slippery surfaces and in biting winds. Accidents, falls in icy water, frostbite were common. Then these ice blocks were brought to the castle on sledges or carts. There they were stored in specially constructed glaciers or ice cellars. These structures were deep, well-insulated pits or stone chambers, often dug into the ground or carved into the rock, with thick walls and a roof covered with straw, earth, or sawdust. The bottom of the glacier usually had a drainage system for the discharge of meltwater. The ice was laid in layers, interspersed with straw, sawdust, or dry earth to further improve insulation and prevent sticking together. Thanks to this isolation, the ice could remain in the glacier until the next winter, and sometimes even longer. During the spring and summer, this ice was used to cool and preserve perishable products, meat, especially after slaughtering livestock, fish, dairy products, butter, and sometimes to cool beverages. This made it possible to significantly extend the shelf life of products, prevent their spoilage, and as a result, avoid starvation and food poisoning, which were common causes of death in the Middle Ages. Thus, the ice barns were not just a convenience, but a critical element of the castle's food security. They demonstrate an amazing understanding of the principles of thermodynamics and conservation, as well as the ability of medieval people to perform large-scale organized work in extreme conditions. It was a cruel but vital use of winter itself, its cold, to ensure survival in the warmer months, when food spoiled particularly quickly. It seems paradoxical and even counterintuitive that in harsh winters, when every grain of heat was worth its weight in gold, some parts of a medieval castle might have had specially designed wind chimneys or narrow, high ventilation shafts that were not part of a complex system of fireplaces. Their main purpose was not heating, but the critical constant circulation of air to combat the ubiquitous dampness and stagnation that were a real scourge in winter in massive stone buildings. Moisture condensed on the cold walls, soaked clothes and bed linen, encouraged the growth of mold, caused rotting wood, and, worst of all, contributed to the spread of diseases, turning the castle into a hotbed of infection. These pipes, often vertical or slightly sloping, channels running through the colossal thickness of the stone walls, sometimes reaching several meters, were designed to open from the outside at different heights, some at the very base of the castle, others on its tops or even on the roofs of towers. This arrangement, creating a difference in height and, as a result, in pressure, formed a natural draft effect, similar to what is observed in well-functioning chimneys, but working on the principles of natural convection. The physical principle is simple and ingenious. Warmer, wetter, and less dense air inside the castle rose up, creating a vacuum. At the same time, colder, denser, but often drier air came in from the outside through the lower openings, while warm, moist, and stagnant air was drawn out through the upper ones. This constant, if barely noticeable but incessant circulation prevented the accumulation of musty, stuffy air, which could become a breeding ground for germs and cause many diseases. Moreover, it actively combated the growth of bald spots and fungus, which not only damaged property, furniture, parchment, books, fabrics, food, but also caused serious respiratory diseases, allergies, and poisoning. A constant, albeit cold, airflow significantly reduced the overall dampness in the premises, preventing damage to supplies and materials. In addition to the discomfort and unpleasant smell, excessive humidity in the castles had disastrous consequences for the health and safety of the structure. It contributed to the rapid spread of diseases, especially lung infections, such as pneumonia, bronchitis, tuberculosis, which in the Middle Ages were deadly and decimated the population. Humidity also dramatically worsened the condition of wood structures, floors, ceilings, load-bearing beams, furniture, doors, gun butts, causing them to rot, warp, crack, and shorten the service life of the entire structure. Thus, these hidden ventilation systems were not just a matter of comfort or preservation of the property, but a vital element of hygiene, disease prevention, and maintaining the integrity of the structure, which was critical for the long-term existence of the castle and its inhabitants, especially in conditions of a long siege. It was a kind of hidden breathing system of the castle, working on the ancient principles of draft, convection, and passive ventilation. The people of the Middle Ages may not have had a scientific explanation of these phenomena in terms of thermodynamics or aerodynamics, but they intuitively understood their effectiveness and vital importance. These air ducts could be cleverly disguised as ordinary architectural elements, such as narrow slits, niches, or even fake decorative elements, making them invisible to the uninitiated eye, but vital for survival during the long, cold, and wet winter months. Their presence also helped to remove unpleasant odors from people, animals, if they were kept inside, for example, in stables on the first floor, kitchens, open toilets, cloakrooms, and sewage pits, thereby significantly improving the overall sanitary situation and quality of life in the fortress. This was evidence of amazing practical thinking, aimed at creating at least some acceptable standard of living in conditions of constant cold and crowding. Unlike modern hermetic doors equipped with multi-circuit seals, high-precision mechanisms, and designed for maximum heat and sound insulation, medieval doors in castles, even the most massive, oak or iron, fastened with forged hinges, and reinforced with steel strips, were far from airtight. There were always gaps and gaps of various widths between the door leaf and the massive jamb, and the wood itself could shrink, crack, and deform over time, exacerbating the problem of leakiness. In this context, a seemingly insignificant detail, the keyhole played a special role in passive ventilation of rooms, although it is completely unobvious for a modern person, zameczna skwajna. Although it appears to be only a functional keyhole, a constant, if subtle, flow of air passed through it, as well as through numerous slits around the perimeter of the door leaf. In cold weather, of course, this current could be felt as an unpleasant, biting draft that made the occupants shiver, wrap themselves in furs, and curse the cold that permeated the room. However, in large, poorly ventilated rooms, where massive hearths burned, emitting smoke and consuming huge amounts of oxygen to maintain combustion, the keyhole, along with other small cracks around the door, could serve as an unconscious but vital microduct. This tiny but constant supply of fresh, if icy, air was absolutely essential for several critical functions. First, it provided the minimum but sufficient amount of oxygen needed to keep the fire burning in the hearth, preventing it from dying out due to lack of oxygen and incomplete combustion of fuel. After all, the extinguished fire meant instant immersion in icy cold and darkness. Second, and most importantly for survival, this influx of air helped prevent the accumulation of carbon monoxide, an invisible, odorless, tasteless, but deadly product of incomplete combustion of wood or coal. Carbon monoxide is the leading cause of death in enclosed spaces with open fires or poorly functioning chimneys, causing poisoning, loss of consciousness, and death. Without this minimal air supply, even if it felt like a draft and caused discomfort, the rooms could quickly fill up with carbon monoxide. This would lead to suffocation, loss of consciousness, and ultimately the death of the inhabitants, who were unaware of the invisible threat. Thus, what at first glance seemed to be a clear flaw in the architecture of medieval doors, their leakiness could actually be an unintentional but vital mechanism for safety and passive ventilation. People of that time, of course, did not understand the complex chemistry of combustion and the molecular nature of the danger of carbon monoxide, but they probably intuitively felt the need to breathe the room, even if it was accompanied by some discomfort from the cold. Zamość the keyhole, along with other small holes and crevices in the walls and windows, became not just a keyhole, but an invisible, but absolutely necessary light of the castle room, supporting life in the harsh winter months. This element shows how even the smallest, seemingly insignificant details of architecture had hidden but critical functionality for survival in an environment where technology was limited, and nature showed its indomitable power, forcing people to show incredible ingenuity. In a world without central heating, when the air temperature in the castle's bedrooms could drop to 0 or lower, and every night was a test of strength, warming the bed before going to bed became not just a matter of comfort, but a vital necessity. Hocha, in later times, special metal hot water bottles with hot coals appeared in the early Middle Ages, and also everywhere among those who could not afford expensive metal products, simpler but more effective methods were used. One of these methods was the use of underbed hot pots. Ordinary, thick-walled clay or ceramic pots that were used for cooking. These pots, after cooking food or boiling water, contained residual heat, but most often they were specially filled with hot coals from the hearth or hot ashes, and then tightly closed with a lid to prevent smoke and sparks from escaping. The top of the pot was wrapped in several layers of thick cloth, hides, or wool blankets, so that it did not burn and kept warm longer. After that, such a thermos was placed under the heavy blankets of the bed for some time before the person was going to go to bed. The heat from the pot slowly but surely spread throughout the space under the blankets, warming the straw or feather mattress and bedding. This created a local heat zone, significantly increasing the temperature inside the bed. For someone who was going to spend many hours in a cold room, this was an incredible relief. A warm bed helped you fall asleep faster, prevented hypothermia, and reduced the risk of running diseases, which were extremely dangerous in the absence of effective medications. This practice was especially important for children, the elderly, and the sick, for whom maintaining body temperature was critical. In fact, it was a primitive heating system running on accumulated heat. In some cases, if the pot was well insulated and did not smoke, it could be left in bed all night to keep warm. However, this required great care not to cause a fire, especially if straw mattresses were used, silt and carbon monoxide poisoning if the coals smoldered in an enclosed space. However, the benefits of this method in harsh winter conditions outweighed the risks. This simple but ingenious method demonstrates how people of the Middle Ages used the most affordable household items to solve vital tasks, showing ingenuity in the struggle for warmth and survival. In a medieval castle surrounded by a hostile world, access to medicines and qualified medical care was extremely limited. Any wound or infection could be fatal. In such circumstances, the inhabitants of the castle were forced to rely on the most primitive but affordable means that could be found directly on the stone walls or in the surrounding forests. One of these unexpected sources of medicine was moss and lichen. These seemingly nondescript plants that covered the damp stones of the castle walls and the trees around them had a number of properties that were intuitively used for healing. Some types of moss, such as sphagnum, peat moss, have amazing absorbent and antiseptic properties. Sphagnum is able to absorb moisture up to 20 times its own weight and contains phenolic compounds that inhibit bacterial growth. In an environment where bandages were rare and sterility was an unknown concept, moss could be used as a primitive but effective wound dressing. It was applied to cuts, abrasions, and even purulent ulcers to absorb the discharge and prevent infection. Lichens, in turn, were also used in folk medicine. Some species, such as Iceland moss, Citraria islandensis, contain usnic acid, which has strong antibiotic properties. Decoctions of lichens could be used to treat coughs, colds, sore throats, and even tuberculosis. Their bitter taste was a sign of the power of the medicine. Imagine a knight who has been wounded in battle or training, or a servant who has cut himself while working. Instead of sterile bandages and antibiotics, a compress of moss collected directly from the castle wall was applied to the wound. This was not only an act of desperation, but also a display of deep knowledge of nature and its resources. Of course, the effectiveness of such methods was variable, and the risk of infection is still high, but in the absence of other options, this was the only hope for survival. This fact is horrifying in its primitiveness, but at the same time impresses with the ingenuity and observation of the people of the Middle Ages, who turned the environment into their pharmacy. The stone walls of the castle were not only a defense against enemies, but also a source of vital resources to fight the invisible enemy, disease. The castle's cellars, which primarily served to store vital supplies of wine, ale, beer, cider, and other fermented beverages, served a much more complex and critically important dual function in winter. They were not just a place to preserve supplies from spoilage and theft, but also played the role of a massive natural thermos that maintains a stable temperature in conditions of extremely low temperatures outside. These cellars, often located deep underground, sometimes several levels below the surface of the ground, or elaborately carved directly into the hard rocky foundations of the castle, were designed with amazing precision for that time and understanding of the principles of thermal insulation in order to have the most stable temperature all year round. Their thick stone walls, often a meter or more thick, as well as natural earth insulation, a multi-meter layer of earth or rock surrounding the cellar on all sides, prevented winter frost from entering, effectively preventing valuable drinks from freezing. Unlike regular water, which freezes at 0 degrees Celsius, wine and ale containing alcohol, even in small amounts, have a lower freezing point, usually from 5 to 10 degrees, depending on the strength of the drink. However, even such temperatures would be disastrous for stocks, as freezing would cause the liquid to expand, rupture in wooden barrels and glass bottles, if they were already in use, completely spoil the taste, ferment, and irretrievably lose precious stocks that sometimes took years to collect. Maintaining cellar temperatures in the range of -30 to +112 typical of most wine and beer cellars, was critical not only for preventing freezing, but also for proper maturation and maintaining the quality of beverages. In winter, when there is a catastrophic shortage of clean drinking water due to freezing springs, contamination of wells, or problems with delivery in deep snow, Fermented beverages often formed the basis of the daily diet of the inhabitants of the castle. They were not only the only available source of fluids, but also an important source of calories needed to keep you going in the cold. B vitamins, especially in the case of ale and beer, and even some nutrients. Moreover, the alcohol contained in these drinks, although in small doses, could give a short-term feeling of warmth, help to cope with stress, monotony, and discomfort from the cold, improving morale. The preservation of these supplies was not a simple matter of comfort or gastronomy, but a vital necessity for the survival of the entire garrison, the aristocracy, their families and servants, locked up in the fortress for the long, gloomy months of winter, and sometimes under siege. Freezing or spoilage of supplies could lead to starvation, thirst, mass diseases, and a catastrophic drop in morale, which in a siege or even just a harsh winter would be tantamount to defeat. Thus, the castle cellars were not just storehouses, but vital arteries, ensuring the sustainability and survival of the entire castle community in the harsh winter, demonstrating a deep knowledge of the principles of thermal insulation, conservation, and logistics. It was a well-thought-out engineering solution that combined a defensive function, protecting supplies from enemies, with a life support function, protecting against cold and spoilage, turning the castle's dungeons into a complex life-sustaining system. These underground heat stores were a key element of survival, which is rarely thought about, but without which life in a medieval castle in winter would have been almost impossible. In a medieval castle, where the nights were pitch black and the windows were small and dim, light was not just a convenience, but a vital necessity for working, moving, and maintaining order. However, wax was expensive and available only to the nobility. For most of the inhabitants of the castle, the main source of light was fat lamps, primitive lamps that work on animal fat. It was not just a technology, but a constant, unpleasant, but vital process of processing all animal remains. Imagine, after the slaughter of cattle or game, every part of the animal was used to the last. Fat or lard was carefully collected and remelted. This process, called fat melting, was dirty and smelly, filling the kitchen or special rooms with an acrid smell. The resulting fat, often still warm and smelling, was poured into simple clay or metal bowls. In the center of the bowl was placed a wick made of twisted cloth, moss, or even dried cane core. When the wick was lit, it burned slowly, absorbing the fat and spreading a dim, flickering light. These lamps were cheap to produce, as fat was a byproduct of the meat diet. They were used everywhere, in barracks, in kitchens, in dungeons, in corridors. However, their use was fraught with a number of problems. The fat lamps smoked heavily, filling the air with soot that settled on the walls, ceilings, and clothing. They gave off an unpleasant, rancid smell, especially if the fat was stale or of poor quality. In addition, their light was very weak, barely dispelling the darkness, and they required constant attention. The wick had to be adjusted, and the fat was replenished. Despite all the inconveniences, fat lamps were irreplaceable. They allowed people to work after sunset, move around the castle at night, and also provided minimal lighting for the guards. In an environment where the night was full of dangers, from crashes to accidents, any light source was valuable. This fact is horrifying in its primitiveness and unpleasant odors, but at the same time impresses with the ingenuity and resource intensity of medieval people, who turned every part of the animal into a resource for survival, even into a light source that allows you to drive away the darkness. We've just taken a dive into the harsh but surprisingly inventive reality of a medieval English castle. We saw a world where survival was a daily struggle and comfort was an unattainable luxury. From the use of animal heat to bloodletting as a rescue, from ice barns to smoke kitchens, from candle clocks to waste disposal and the use of bones as fuel, every aspect of life in the castle was subordinated to one goal: to live another day. These facts may have destroyed your romantic ideas about knights and beautiful ladies, but they also showed the incredible resilience, ingenuity, and adaptability of our ancestors. They were not just inhabitants of stone walls, but part of a complex living system of survival, where every resource, every detail of architecture, and every natural feature was used to the limit. If this journey into the past has made you think and wonder, Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss out on exciting new stories about the secrets of the past. Click the subscribe button and a bell to always keep up to date with our new videos. See you soon.